Hollywood costume. In the 1890s, filmmaking begins in the U.S. In New York, costume design was often the responsibility of the actors themselves. So during this time, there wasn't any actual studio executives. It didn't have its own section in filmmaking. So during this time, if an actor wanted a role in a film, they would have to come dressed as that character. So if you were a housemaid, you had to be dressed as a housemaid. Whatever your character was, that was the character you came dressed as. And based on that and your acting, that would heighten your chances of being cast in a role. That did benefit people and women that had vast wardrobes. However, those actresses who did not have the access to that kind of wardrobe, unfortunately, often did not get those roles. So it often went to those who already had access to a huge wardrobe, and they had a better chance of having access to the costume that was required for the shoot. Film producer Adolf Zukar introduces the concept of costuming. So he turns costuming into a creative aspect and a creative part of the filming process. Now, the second person that began to introduce the idea of costume designing was the director D.W. Griffith. He introduced the practice of creating costumes specifically for American-made films. So overseas, in Paris and those other places, they already had started to begin to introduce those concepts. So D.W. Griffith began to introduce the concepts for American-made films. So these two people began to create the budding ideas of what costume design would eventually become today. So we can credit those two individuals with costume designing and its origins. In producing films and making sure that the films were authentic down to the costumes that they were. So one of them made sure that the film's designer concept was something that was seen as a creative artist. So someone who was a part of, even as you're doing the storylines for a movie, they wanted to make sure that the costumes matched the movie. So think about some of your favorite movies that you've seen over the years. Some of the things we remember about those movies are the beautiful clothes within the movies. For me, The Great Gatsby, both versions were just breathtaking examples of how important costuming is to a film. Because I remember that more than anything, more than the plot line, more than the characters. I remember just some of these very beautiful, well done pieces. By the 1920s, costume design becomes a normal part of the filming and budget process. So now they have to factor it in. So now they say, okay, we need to hire a staff. We need to hire a group of people that's going to be able to make a lot of these pieces come to life. So it becomes added to a part of the budget. So no longer is it the responsibility of the auditioning actors to come up with the pieces for the film. Now they have a whole team that they're assembling to create these pieces for the film. So what is a costume designer? Well, a costume designer is a person who designs costumes for a film, production, TV show, focusing on key periods or moments in time. So again, Hollywood costuming is essentially coming together saying, what period are we talking about? What period are we focusing on? What elements of that period do we want to make sure comes across on screen, whether it's through TV show or whether it's through film? Imagine watching your favorite TV show that's set in Hollywood in the 1920s and everyone is wearing their normal everyday 2020 clothing. It'd be hard to get into a movie or a show like that, especially since the 1920s were known as such an opulent time. Would you want to watch something that essentially had people in jeans and a t-shirt? So that just kind of once again pushes forth the idea that costuming and making sure the pieces were appropriate to that period in time was so vital and important to the film industry. One of the first designers to sort of get on the bandwagon, as we would say, to costume design was, remember him, Paul Pior. So he was someone we discussed in previous lessons. He was one of those featured couture designers that we talked about. If you have not yet been able to access that video or have a look at it, I encourage you to go. I go through great detail about who he was, what were key elements of his designs, key features. So I would definitely recommend you going back there to really understand how amazing it was that Pierrette participated in pioneering sort of the film costuming portion of his career. His initial designs were a part of the film, the French film, The Loves of Queen Elizabeth. Those images from that French film, and you can see how absolutely breathtaking that design is. And again, kind of picture what would that film have looked like if an actor themselves had to come up with the costume themselves. Maybe they could have gone to a seamstress, but it just goes to show you how having someone that will definitely elevate the look to something that is more memorable on screen. It would come as no surprise then that once you start introducing couture designers to participating in costuming, that it would begin to usher in a very glamorous, opulent time for Hollywood, a time that we call the golden age of Hollywood. Now, this is one of my favorite times in Hollywood. When I think about Hollywood and I think about old Hollywood glamour, this is definitely something that attracted me to designing and fashion. I wanted to create gowns like that. I wanted to create these very elaborate, glamorous pieces that I often saw in the movies. That's what sort of attracted me, especially at a very young age, to the designing process. Was I always knew that I wanted to create really intricate, beautiful, over-the-top, one would say, designs when I did start creating pieces. So the golden age of Hollywood cinema was from the 1910s to the 1960s. And when we think about the golden age of Hollywood, we think about pin curls, red lipstick. You'll see that I've attached a PDF illustration of some of the key features in the old Hollywood, the golden age of Hollywood design. And you'll see that I added the red lips, the feather boas, the sequin gowns, and it just goes into a greater detail illustration of what that looked like. So if you were to recreate that, these are some of the elements that you want to make sure your design has if you're trying to recreate that old Hollywood look. Now, some of those icons from that time, or that we'll remember, that their legacy essentially lives on because they were such a huge part of the golden age of Hollywood. Marilyn Monroe, of course, she had many films during that time. Gentlemen Prefer Blondes, 7 Year Itch. So she had quite a few films that elevated her to stardom. Of course, Judy Garland, we know her from The Wizard of Oz. Lauren Bacall, she was also in a lot of films. She's most notable known to be with Humphrey Bogart, who was another huge actor during that time. Jane Mansfield was another actor. I don't know many of the films that she was in. We also have Grace Kelly, Princess of Monaco. She was also in quite a few films. One of the most notable is Alfred Hitchcock films. I believe The Rear Window was one of those films. Grace Kelly is a fashion icon in her own right. A lot of people were inspired by a lot of the pieces that she wore. Even most recently, Kate Middleton, her wedding gown, if you are able to do some side-by-side photos of those two designs, you'll see that they have similarities. Inspired by Grace Kelly's wedding gown. So again, she was a fashion icon in her own right. We also have Jean Harlow, another vixen of her time, and Elizabeth Taylor, who is probably the most recent and one of the most familiar as well. She was in many films, one of them being Cleopatra. So these are some of the icons from that period. Obviously, there are many more, but I just chose to sort of pluck out these few gals so that you are able to see that if you go back and look into some of the photos, why they were such large representations of the golden age of Hollywood. They completed the looks with the red lipstick, the voluptuous shapes, the sweeping soft curled hair, the satin gowns. They sort of epitomize what the golden age of Hollywood looked like. Thanks for watching. Be sure to like and subscribe. Videos are uploaded weekly covering dressmaking, fashion, lectures, and more.